Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Joe. Good morning, everyone. If you weren't here last week, this is a surprise, as John mentioned. Mary Ann has had some stuff going on in her life. She was obviously with many of you in China for the last 2 weeks. And then when she was there, her best friend Nan made her transition. And she is now in California working through all of that and doing the service this week. So we hold her. We also hold her knowing that in the midst of it all, she's also suffering from bronchitis and pneumonia. So she has a lot of stuff on her, so we're going to hold her through all of this. You know, she actually called me from China, so I knew it was bad news when the phone rings and you're spending that kind of money on international calls. And she told me what happened and asked if I would step in today, and of course I said yes. And it was a busy week in my life already, so I thought, how am I going to find time to come up with something else, because you've already heard all 5 of my sermons. So when Sherry in the church office called and said, hey, I need the sermon title for this week, I said, just go with whatever Mary Ann had. I'll make something fit. So you'll see on the front of your program, her sermon title is The Story of Life. Now, I don't know whose story she was going to tell you about, but I got to thinking about all the stories, all the 5 sermons I have in my bag of tricks. And the story of life, I thought, oh, well, that's the Easter story. I'll just bring him the Easter story. The story of resurrection, the story of new life. Or I could bring them the other creation story, the story of baby Jesus' birth, the Christmas story. But I figured if it's just barely too early to turn on Christmas lights, it's barely too early to hear the Christmas story. That's next month. So today I do want to talk a little bit about the Easter story, but in a different way. Because I think if the Easter story and the Christmas story are the greatest stories ever told, I wondered all week, why do we only tell them once a year? If they're so good, why do we so infrequently share the story? And as I thought about that, I asked a few friends their perception of that. And it was interesting to hear what came back. We already know the ending to both those stories. I already know what it's all about. And in truth, it's kind of lost a little bit of its meaning. Because however old you are, you've heard it that many times, right? And over the course of your life experience, those stories begin to get stagnant and fade in their meaning. And yet, we tell them over and over and over. Next week, tens of thousands of people will travel all over the globe just for a piece of turkey. In a couple of weeks from there, people will travel all over the globe just to tell and hear another story they already know. So what is this story thing? You know, I have talked about story, and I've talked about story in both of these particular occasions. But the story of life is interesting, and if I get time today, I'll tell you the whole meaning of life and all that good stuff. We probably won't have time for that, but just in case. But the spiritual story, whether it's of Mary and Joseph or Jesus himself, is really this monumental understanding that we're all on this journey, and journeys end. They just do. Journeys come to an end. And in the end of the story, we are transcended or transformed because of the story. So I thought I would play a little twist on this today. I'm going to focus on the thing called story rather than telling the great story of Easter or Christmas. Once upon a time, that's how all good stories began, right? Once upon a time, there was a family who lived in Fort Payne, Alabama. This only happened about 30 years ago. Fort Payne, Alabama, at that time was a town of about 8,000 people. It was known around the world, however, for doing one thing: making socks. The old athletic white crew sock that we all wore in gymnasium. They had so many sock mills in Fort Payne, Alabama, 150 of them to be exact. That's all they did. 8,000 people lived there. 10,000 people were employed in the sock mills. So that was the town. That was it. At that time, about 30 years ago, out of Fort Wayne, Alabama, came so many socks that you have a pair of those socks in a drawer somewhere right now. I can guarantee it. Because 2 out of every 7 socks made in the world came out of Fort Wayne, Alabama. Not out of the United States, not out of China, but out of the entire world. One particular sock mill there, the Emma G. sock mill, was owned by a family, ran by a family called the Locklears. Mr. and Mrs. Locklear had 2 daughters, Emily and Gina. That's where they got the title, the name of their sock mill, the M-E-G. And as the girls grew up in the sock mill, Emily really just wanted to run away. She wanted to go do anything other than make socks. So she was telling her parents all about her plans for college and marriage and children. And her parents sat there and said, "Oh, I thought you were going to take over the family business and stay here and do this." But she said, "I don't want to do that. I have a different story I want to live into." So she did. She went to college, she got married a well-to-do attorney in Atlanta, and still lives there. Gina, on the other hand, the youngest of the 2, loved being in the sock mill every day. She played in the sock bins. She just loved everything, the machines, the people, the whole experience. And when it was her time to go to college, she went, but she hated every minute of it. And after college, she got a job, and she hated every minute of it. So she went back to school. She went to real estate school, became a realtor, hated showing houses, hated the people who wanted to look at houses. She hated everything. She just wanted to be back in Alabama in the sock mill. And so trying to find herself and trying to find the story that she wanted to live into, she experimented with a lot of things. She started shopping at different places. She became a vegetarian. She was at Whole Foods one day, pushing her buggy, buying only organic produce and vegetables. And she was in that little area where you can buy things like the makeup and the lotions and the gloves and the socks. And she said, "What if I go back to Alabama and make socks that I could sell in places like this?" Because they were just selling socks to anyone like Walmart or Target. There was no branding of the socks none of the socks that came out of Alabama were branded. They were just white labeled. And then when Walmart or Target would get them, they would make them their brand. But she wanted her own brand, and she wanted to make it out of organic cotton. And every sock in Alabama was white, but she wanted color. So she went home. She told her parents this great idea, this great story that she had. And they said, "Well, it's a good story and it's a great idea, but our machines are not capable of using that kind of yarn and thread. The dyed cotton is very expensive. The cotton mills are shutting down. The sock mills are shutting down. Matter of fact, today there's only about a dozen of them left there out of 150, just 30 years ago. Most of our socks are now made in China." But she could not let go of this dream. She happened to know one gentleman at the sock mill. His name is Vance Veal. She had grown up around him. He'd worked in the sock mill all his life. His parents worked there. His grandparents worked in the sock mill. He knew everything about it. And he was like a big brother to her growing up. Vance went to Unity, just outside of Fort Wayne, Alabama. He never mentioned the name of the church, but he lived the principles. And every day that he was with Gina, she would begin, as a little girl always does, about telling her stories, this grandiose story of going to college and doing this and doing that. And he would affirm with her, you are the essence of whatever that thing is you call God and love and spirit. And you can do anything. You got this. He believed in her. He told her. He affirmed her. And when she was gone, she missed her mom and dad. She missed the sock mill, but she really missed Vance's teaching. He was like her guru. So one day she went back. She said, I really want to do this. Well, the sock mill was about to close anyway. The economy was bust. And she said, I'm going to try it. This is my life story, and I'm just going to try it. And Vance was there, and he said, put a plan together. So she did. And her plan included creating a team of conscious people who would be there with her and affirm that this was possible, that you could make socks made out of color on these machines, and we could sell it to the world. Not the story that you and I might want to live into, but it was hers. And as she was talking to Vince about this, he, of course, was living his principles, and he said, I've told you all your life you can do whatever you want. But there's one caveat. Before you do it, before you act on it, sit with it. Sit with your story in prayer and meditation. Just sit with it and let it speak to you so that you can tell the story differently. So she said, okay, I'll give you 1 week. We'll do it. So they sat in the quiet for a week, just meditating, thinking about it, not talking a lot about it, just letting it seep into them. Her parents kept saying, it's a good story, but I just don't know how it's going to come to fruition. Now I'm going to leave Gina's story for just a moment. Because again, this sermon title that Mary Ann had probably planned months ago got me thinking about what I talked about last week. Remember I told you I was digging around on this path in the Rio Grande Gorge, trying to dig up this stone, this rock. It got me thinking about the Easter story, because there was a big stone involved in the Easter story. One of my favorite parts of that story is when the women go to the tomb of Jesus. They say, on their way there, who's going to roll the stone away? You would think they might have planned that a little better than being on the way, but that's how it worked. Who's going to roll the stone away? And they begin to say these things. You can find it in several of the Gospels. We're not strong enough. We're not enough to do that. So I wonder who's going to do it for us. Well, of course, you know the rest of the story. They got there. The stone had been rolled away. There was an angel sitting on it. You know that part of the story. But really, the life experience that this particular sermon title taught me this week is that life isn't this beginning and end like we'd always thought about it. It's not the birth and the death, but it's this moment in the life experience and this moment between the birth and the death and this now moment and this now moment. And I truly believe that a happy life is just a string of those happy moments. Does that make sense to you? That happy moment that you recognize throughout any given day, you could milk that for all it's worth and make it last several moments or several days. And that's really what resurrection is all about. It's another word for transformation. You know, I'm a transformational coach. I wonder what kind of clients I would get if I put on my business card, resurrection coach. Do you think anyone would come? But we are so busy trying to get this happy life that we have to remember it's all about the happy moments in the life that make that life so enjoyable. So the transformation question I want you to ponder today is this. How many lives have you had? How many lives have you had? Now, a lot of you believe in reincarnation. I'm not necessarily talking about past lives. I'm talking about how many lives have you had this week, this month? How many times have you rolled away a stone of doubt or worry or stress so that you could see beyond that and into a new life? because you are the author of every chapter of whatever this story is. You're the co-author of it, actually, with Spirit, with that which you call God. And you're writing that story according to the choices that you make, according to whatever is in your way, whether you move it or you become paralyzed because of it. And so when I want to change the direction of my path, all I have to do is make a different choice, make a different decision. There's a scripture in Romans that you've all heard of. Again, no new story here. Romans 12, verse 2 says this: "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind," by the changing of your story. I have several Bibles, as you can imagine, and concordances and dictionaries, so I was trying to look up an even better translation to this particular verse, and I found one in the New Living Translation. It says this: "Do not copy the behaviors or the customs or the conditions of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know the will of God, which is always good and pleasing and perfect." We have lots of thoughts every day. Science tells us we have about 70,000 of them every day. And we tend to want to believe a lot of them, when science also tells us most of them are not true. In fact, only a third of your thoughts are ever true in any given day. Now, as I was thinking about this sermon title, and I was thinking about story, I thought, well, I'd better jump into the rest of it, because she said the story of life. So I went to my handy dictionary and I looked up the definition of life. I thought I knew what it was. Actually, the definition of life is this: life is a condition. I love that. I've been in the medical field for 25 years. Life is a condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity for growth, reproduction, functional activities, and a continual change preceding death. Now, your reality is always responding to a vibration. That's just how it happens. And your reality is responding to whatever vibration you have put off for a long time. We have one of our unity principles that says our thoughts, when they're held in mind, will produce and reproduce after their kind, right? We've been telling that story for lots and lots of years in the New Thought movement. Today, Unity and other New Thought movements are putting a twist on that story. It's not that the story isn't true, it's just that we're understanding it's become a little stagnant. It rhymed, it was cute and catchy, but it wasn't quite the full story. The full story that we're teaching today is that thoughts and feelings held in consciousness produce in consciousness. The reason we tell it differently is because we have been telling a story that we hold everything in mind. Where do you think mind is? When I say the word mind, we automatically think it's up here. But mind is separate from the brain. Consciousness or mind can be used interchangeably, and they're in every cell of our being. You have consciousness everywhere in your little toe. So when we say our thoughts and our feelings, because they are attached, that are held in consciousness, then produce and reproduce in that stream of consciousness. Now, last week I talked a lot about letting go, about non-attachment, and it really is an understanding that when we erase from our consciousness any thought that's contrary to the truth, then we have just rolled a big stone out of our way, an untruth out of the way, so that we can look and see the greater story. I don't know if Mary Ann still says this phrase. It's something I adopted from her through being on this stage with her for 10 years. And I said it in the meditation today. Beyond the appearance of things. You've heard her and me say that. When we think about looking beyond the appearance of things, circumstances, conditions, looking past that, We look at the greater story, the big story, because again, we are co-creators with Spirit, and we're creating our own reality through our thoughts and our beliefs. And there is this paradigm that we teach in metaphysics that says that which you're living is evidence of that which you're thinking. And that which you're thinking is evidence of that which you're feeling. And that which you're feeling is evidence of that which you're living. And that which you're living is evidence of that which you're thinking. And that which you're thinking is evidence of that which you're feeling. And that which you're feeling is evidence of that which you're living. And that which you're living is evidence. It's called spiral dynamics. I call it motion sickness. Because it just goes on and on. There's a thought, there's a feeling, there's a life that comes from it. So, here's the thing. If you're not enjoying your life or your reality in the moment, you get to change your mind about it. You get to choose a different thought, a different belief, a different feeling. In other words, if you're thinking negative thoughts, then the next thought is likely to be negative. And if you string those moments together, that's not a very happy life. But if you do the reverse, then the opposite is true. So we have thought for a long time about watching our thoughts. And we're now saying, that's a full-time job. Don't watch your thoughts, because you have so many of them, you can't see them all, you can't feel them all, you'll never get anything else done. So instead of watching our thoughts and feelings, we have to remember that our thoughts, all of them, are always based on a divine idea. Because thoughts that are formed and influenced by the outer is always felt on the inner, and vice versa. And they help to shape or develop and mold our human experience. So I'm going to read you a couple of quotes this morning. I want you to see if you can find a theme here. You've heard some of the stories of our co-founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, but listen to this from Stephen Covey. All things are created twice, first mentally and then physically. The key to creativity is to begin with the end in mind, the full story, the vision, because that's the blueprint of a desired result. Robin Sharma, who is the author of a great book called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, he wrote this: everything is created twice, first in the mind and then in reality. Albert Einstein once said, imagination is everything. It's the preview of life's coming attractions. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, a person is what he or she thinks about all day long. The Buddha said, all that we are is a result of all that we've thought. Gandhi said, a man is but the product of his thoughts, because what he thinks he becomes. Do you see a theme? Everything that you're thinking. We used to sing a song here called Every Thought a Prayer. Every thought becomes this prayer. And once it's in mind, it comes to life at the level of consciousness. At this point, we have this powerful choice that we can either attach to that, believe that thought, or change our mind and believe one that's more gentle, more inspiring. So, as we think about all of this today, and I've just asked you, how many lives have you led this week? Essentially, I think we have been taught over the course of time that we can create our lives by hacking away at this frozen, icy block and try to find the masterpiece in it. But that's kind of backwards thinking, because you came here to create, not to chip away and recreate something that was there. Our current reality is not here because we chiseled it into being. Our current reality is the result of a universe of ideas that is flowing into the construct of our individual and collective consciousness. And we came forth knowing for sure that there would be a lot of contrast on this journey. You know, there is a story of a man who was working in his garage. He had the garage door open, and just outside the door, a cocoon had fallen off of the tree or the wall. And he noticed that there was a butterfly trying to emerge from the cocoon. And as he's cleaning the garage out, he just kind of looks over there every 5 minutes or so because he kind of wants to watch this miracle happen. And the butterfly struggles and struggles and struggles to get out of this cocoon. And it's got this little bitty hole at the end of it that's trying to push its way through. Well, he couldn't stand it anymore. So he reaches into his workbench and he gets this little pair of scissors and he goes over and he says, I'm just going to help it along. I'm going to cut that cocoon just enough so he can get out. So here's the magic or the science about all of this. Every butterfly has to go through that little hole because physics tells us that it's already dissolved into this icky, gooey mess. And even though it's going to come out wonderful and dry and be able to fly, it first has to go through the contrast, that little hole, so that all the fluid is pushed out of its body, through its wings, and then it can emerge. So this man, in his haste and impatience, had done the wrong thing. He had cut the entire cocoon. So now you just have this butterfly that's not ever going to be able to fly, and it just wanders off this icky, gooey, sticky mess. And I think that's really, in therapy, we would call him an enabler. And to understand that we too do that to our loved ones all the time. We do it to our kids, to our grandkids. We do it to ourselves. We push our way through this. And many people are fearful of any other kind of change, of course. We talked about that last week. But the expected or the unexpected have to be experienced in order for this life to be one of freedom, one of happiness. Jung said every transformation demands as its reconciliation the end of a world, the collapse of an old story of life. You didn't tell a story of limitation or lack and then find abundance. You told a story of limitation and lack, and then you found your checkbook empty. And so we have to understand that whatever story we're telling, not just verbally, but through our actions, because those are often louder than words, every story we will live into. Every story has an end, but in life, every end is a new beginning. And we are stepping into that new beginning. Someone asked me last week here, when I talked about capacity, they said, how do you activate your spiritual capacity? I think your capacity to say yes to whatever that is that makes your soul sing is only as great as your capacity to say no to what doesn't. I think that the first step towards getting somewhere is to decide that you're not going to stay where you are, which is nowhere. And so all of this story for me this week has been a story of not becoming, but of unbecoming. Not of learning, but unlearning what I thought I knew. Of training my mind differently, of renewing my mind so that I can go through a different kind of story, because the story has already been written. It's already done. And it sounds nothing like your once upon a time story, because it looks nothing like your past. To tell the story as you wish it to be means that you're telling the story that God knows about you, that your inner being knows about you. You know, there's a lot of stories that we tell. And in my work in grief and end-of-life care, I've heard a lot of those stories, such as time is precious. It's a good story. I just don't know that it's very precious when it's really just an illusion. Time is an illusion. And what you perceive as precious is not necessarily that moment in time, but that moment out of time. That now moment that you're so present to that time just stops. I ask you again, what story is being propagated and perpetuated within you? Because you have a choice in every new moment to tell a different story. Imagine how many times people have walked up to you and said, "Hi, how are you?" And you've told the story, "I'm fine." Of course, we all have that one friend who's not ever fine, and we just don't ask them that anymore. What if, though, all of the world came up and said instead, "Hi, who are you?" What's your story then? Would you tell the story of all of the scars of your past? Or would you tell all of the story of all the gifts of your past? Because, again, you're going to step into whatever story you're telling. And we can tell the consciousness behind the story by the story that's told, can't we? Now, when we live into that story, we don't do it because of fear or that consciousness of lack. We think of the inspiration. Again, last week I told you a story of digging a stone up. This week, I had another stone appear in my life. If you follow me on Facebook, you know I was in a little car accident this week. I'm obviously fine. My car is not. I ended up flying through the air, landing on this rock the size of a smart car, and had to be lifted off of it and put onto a tow bed. And I've learned a lot of lessons about stones recently. I'm quite weary of the lessons about the stones. Matter of fact, this particular sermon series, all of 2 weeks, is costing me about $6,000 to $8,000 because of a big stone that I hit. And it was interesting when I climbed out of the car. I just wasn't very involved with the story itself. I had been practicing a lot of non-attachment, of letting go. I got out of the car. I didn't drop any words that I shouldn't have dropped. I just looked at it, and I said, well, that happened. And I walked away, fine. Now, obviously, the story's not done yet. This just happened 2 days ago. But you know, it was interesting because when I stepped out of that story, and when I stepped out of Gina's story about socks a while ago, look what happened. Nothing. Nothing happened when I stepped out of this story. No one here yelled, "Don't step out of the story, still talk about the socks." You didn't throw money at me and say, "Finish the story." But we think that if we step out of our story, the world will fall. But the truth is, nothing much happens. There's no real victim and no rewarder in either of my stories. What would happen, though, if you stepped out of your story? If you stepped out of your story of lack or worry or stress, what would happen? Nothing and everything. Nothing in that there's no victim anymore. Everything in that there's freedom. Everything in that you can look beyond the appearance of everything else and see the greater story. So let me jump back to Gina's story and tell you the rest of it. I told you about Vance. He now runs the day-to-day operations of Gina's sock factory because she wanted a conscious team. He's the head of that. And when Gina went back, she was only there for a few months, and everything changed because she lived into her story. One day, CNN called and said, "We'd like to do a story on your story." And they flew in, and they did one. She is now dubbed the Sock Queen of Alabama. That's all you have to Google in order to read the rest of the story. Vogue magazine called and said, "We'd like to feature your socks." Paris called and said, "We'd like to sell your socks." A boutique in New York called, said, "The socks are the only ones we are selling." She is now in Whole Foods, where she was standing that day selling socks. All of that has come to fruition for her because she didn't let go of it. She didn't let go of that story. She saw beyond the appearance of all the other stuff. And last year, Martha Stewart named Gina one of the most inspirational women in America and gave her an American Made Award, which is given to small business owners every year. I've been thinking a lot about this talk, about socks, about stones, about stuff that I never thought I'd be talking about a month ago. But I kept thinking about Mary Ann too, and I kept thinking about whose story she was going to tell. But the thing is, we can't tell other people's stories very authentically. We only tell our story of their story. Look at the person next to you. You think you know them. You only know your story of them. And that story is his story or her story. And when you put those words together, it's history. It's old, it's past, it's done. And as I'd been thinking about those stories and unworthy stories and unfinished stories and stories of becoming and unbecoming and how to step into a new story, I got home this week. My friend Ann Leach, who we traveled together a little bit, she sent me a little thank you note for the trip we'd taken recently. I didn't think much about this package that I'd thrown on the kitchen counter because I'm an Amazon Prime member. I get packages every day. I opened it yesterday. Now, she knew nothing about this sermon title. In that package was a pair of socks. Because I'd been talking about socks. I'd been telling this story about socks in my mind. And of all the socks that she could have picked out, these socks say story on the bottom of them. And on the top it says, I have a story. So I get this week to literally step into a new story about this life experience. And I think our daily word for today really sums it up best. I'd not heard that till John read it. But to step into a story that's already unfolding is really divine order. And if we can resurrect a story from our past life that might help with our new story, that's fine. But let's transform it into a love story. Let's transform it and continue to live happily ever after by trusting that living happily ever after is the order of the universe. And it's your true life story that wants to unfold. Namaste. Thank you for having me.